Welcome to the Cyber Call, the podcast by Ride of Boom for managed service providers looking to stay ahead in an ever-changing world of cybersecurity. Each week, we dive into the latest threats, trends, and real-world strategies to help MSPs protect their clients and grow their businesses. Let's build a safer, stronger community together.
Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome and very relevant, timely session today following having Phil Langlois from Verizon with us last week. And by the way, Phyllis, I need to see if I can abscond your help and Rolodex to talk to Cyber AccuView, because I think what was really cool was the report that Steve, I'm not sure if you heard about this, or Chris, Chip. For the first time, Verizon put out a follow-up report right after the DBIR called the breach BIS, breach investigative something like that. And it's on their main site. And what's really interesting about it is it comes from, Phil saying, hey, every year we put out all this data, but one of the most common questions they get is, how much are you paying out at the insurance level? What are insurance companies actually paying from all these incidences and breaches, et cetera? Well, there's a firm, and Phyllis will do better justice for me, called Cyber AccuView, which is a consortium of sorts where the big insurance companies are, part of it and provide the data of the claims to it, and they aggregate all that information. So
Cyber AccuView is a consortium, they have AIG, Travelers, Chubb, all the big insurers, and they're working really to help the insurance industry, but also to help organizations with their cyber insurance applications. So that's how we connected with them to create Control Assist, which is a questionnaire based off IG1, because one of their what they wanted to do was to make insurance questionnaires easier for small, medium. So we worked on that with them. And then, of course, they want to be an aggregator of data, like you said, because the actuaries for cyber insurance don't have a ton of data.
Yeah.
Right. And so what they want to do is be able to aggregate that data so they can have some kind of norms for cyber insurance versus, we hear from folks on this call at CIS, we hear from other organizations that are ISAC members. Why is there just one more different question every year? I don't know what these insurers want, so on and so forth. And so Cyber AccuView works to try to answer those questions and work with insurers to respond to the different organizations' needs.
So let's do a touch of banner before we get into today's event. One thing we were talking about off the air, this was an interesting article. And in it talks about the Chinese AI models, and specifically how these models can detect North America users, if you will, versus native Chinese, in-country users. And one of the findings that Booz Allen Hamilton, that was really the force behind this article, is it says that Quen, Minimax generated significant more vulnerabilities, 130% and 20% respectively. And they believe they're working with U.S. government employees, or just in general, it talks through this. And surprisingly, Chip, they were unavailable for comment.
What a stunner!
Does this surprise you at all, Chip? This kind of stuff?
No, it really doesn't. Although the one note in the article that did surprise me was that Kimi doesn't fall into the same basket. It seems to return, similar quality code. I think in the article, I don't have it in front of me right now, they said, as Anthropic, maybe 4.8, which I found that interesting. But look, everybody that I talk to, which is almost daily, somebody in my, orbit, about how they're using AI. Nobody that I'm aware of is using any of the Chinese models, just because of security concerns. I mean, you have no idea what you're really getting into. I'm certainly not going to run one locally, and I don't know anybody that would. And that seems to be the great potential advantage is to run a local model or a super cheap model that comes out of China if you're connected to the frontier side. And I don't know anybody that's biting on that. There's just too much unknown. Personally, I'm gun shy. Like, we haven't been able to really track down everything that China does as a nation state actor and all of the groups inside it. There's still more unknowns than I think are knowns there. So there's no way I'm going near one of their models.
I think I saw an article that Microsoft is actually leveraging DeepSeek in some of what it's doing, which was kind of scary.
Yeah, it mentioned the big companies using it for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, again, we'll get into introing you in a second, but as a company that pulls in, code scanners, API scanners, infrastructure scanners, on and on and on, big aggregator, what's this look like through your lens? Are you seeing companies at the enterprise and large mid-market level being cognizant if they're doing any type of vibe coding or introducing these models?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, most of the companies that we work with are just primarily focused on the frontier labs. And, they want an enterprise service with all the governance wrapped around it and everything else. I think they're all doing experimentation with local models like Quen and stuff like that. But and as are we at Nucleus. But they're, even the best local models from what we see are still 9 months or so behind the best frontier models. And so, for most companies right now, they're still not willing to sacrifice. And then plus, going back to the governance point, they've got to solve for that problem. And with local models, it's a lot more challenging.
Do you think that's on purpose, Steve, the 9 months behind?
I don't know that that's on purpose. I don't think I'd say that's on purpose. Yeah, I mean, it's just going to be interesting to me. I think we'll see a lot more local model adoption when the frontier labs start to kind of taper off with their progress and that gap closes. And that gap, I think, has been closing between local models and the latest frontier models. But as that gap closes more and more, especially with the cost of AI services increasing to the extent that it has in the last year, I think we're going to see a massive explosion of local model usage. And
local models for inference, but the reason that they're behind is that the cost of training, which can really only be done at the hyperscaler level, is just so high. And we successfully embargoed most of the rest of the world from getting access to the necessary chip resources to train. Like, we bought them all up. There's political embargoes against China and others. So, local inference is coming, and training is going to stay with the frontiers.
Right.
Phyllis, I don't know how much you follow, but do you think the entry of, this was a few weeks back where NVIDIA and Microsoft did that announcement together, where Microsoft kind of said, hey, we don't care what model you use, and I'm paraphrasing, right? We want to be, in essence, the OS of AI on a GPU that's you can run, on an NVIDIA new lab, quote unquote, silicon, Microsoft-based laptop. It kind of seems like that's where things are, that optionality is headed.
I mean, I definitely think so. I think, I agree with what everyone has been saying. It's getting more expensive. So people are going to go more towards local models. I mean, even, I think I said this a week or two ago, someone sent me a paper of which, a lot of enterprises are going back on-prem because of AI, because the costs are just too high and the speed for the inference model is like too high as well. They want to bring it on-prem. As far as using these AI models and everything, I think it speaks to, NIST updating their secure by design document to include AI and to address these kinds of things that, back in the day, we'd be like, open source is great. It's got so many eyes on it. You should really, why is government against open source and stuff like that? But it is something where any kind of software that you, including AI, which is an application, you should be doing, implementing best practices to secure it.
Yeah.
Regardless of where it comes from.
Fair. Chip, I'll give you one more macroeconomic riddle me this. So the models these days look at rates of change, obviously, and revenue accelerating, decelerating. That's what really drives, right? Stock prices and everything. If we all of a sudden see any type of rollover from Anthropic and or OpenAI coming public, that can't bode well for them. Even maybe they go vertical to start, but then you start to see a rollover in rate of change. It can't bode well, can it?
Well, first off, I don't think there's going to be a rollover in rate of change that quickly. I wouldn't say we're in the post LLM era, but we're approaching it with researchers that are beginning to acknowledge that LLMs are not going to take us to AGI, to general intelligence. And there's a completely different approach to building AI models or AI systems that doesn't really rely just on LLMs. So I think there's still a lot of runway ahead. For a long time, it's been kind of a 3-horse race, right? It's been Anthropic and OpenAI, to a lesser extent, X kind of starting over and restarting over. And I think they're starting over again, but they've gobbled up a lot of compute. And Japan, in the last, I think, 24, 30 hours, they released a new frontier model called Fuji Ultra, which they're claiming is, on par already with Fable and Mythos. Like, I don't know. I haven't read anybody independently verify any of that, but if all of a sudden there's more entrants in the race that are considered, Western friendly nations, I think the race continues, and people are going to continue pouring resources into the training and development of new models and even new approaches to how we actually get to AGI.
Interesting. Cool. All right, let's dig in here. So one of the questions, if you were on last week, which was really cool, we said to Phil, okay, you got, all these different attacks. You're an MSP, 10 employees. Brian Blakely said, do you focus on X, Y, Z, if you're going to put your eggs and you could only focus on one type of attack, right, and put your resources on it, what would it be? And he said vulnerability management. And as we know, vulnerability management eclipsed, stolen credentials for the first time, as the initial path for breach, right, Phyllis, and which was, in 19 years of writing a report, I know we'll probably hear from Steve. He's not at all surprised. He bet his entire career and company, right, that this would be an area to focus on. So with that, I was like, wow, we've really got to find somebody that understands this subject intimately well. I couldn't think of anybody better, Steve, than bringing you on and talking to us about that. So welcome back to the show. It's been way too long, Steve. For those that out there that may not know you, if you could tell us a little about yourself and what you do over there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Andrew. It's great to be back. We were just talking before we started the show here. I think it's been close to 3 years. But yeah, if you don't know me, I'm Steve Carter. I'm the CEO and a co-founder at Nucleus Security. Just a little bit about myself. I've been working in cyber about 25 years. I spend most of my career helping federal agencies build and scale what we called vulnerability management programs back then. Now you would probably call them exposure management programs. That's the term a lot of folks are using. In 2015, I started a cybersecurity services business where I continued to support federal agencies, but that's also where we began development of the software that became Nucleus. And then in 2019, I started Nucleus Security, and I spent the last 6 years really just focused on our mission, to your point, Andrew, which is to automate vulnerability and exposure management so security teams can prioritize and mitigate risks and avoid breaches. So that's what we did.
Awesome to get you back, Steve. And for those out there, because again, the MSPs often think when you think vulnerability management, they immediately think, oh, they must be a Qualys, a Nessus, Connect Secure. Can you give our folks out there an understanding of what it means when you think about risk-based vulnerability management and the kind of tooling that you guys plug into to help the largest of large manage all of this?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we do have some of that confusion at times. So that's correct. We're not a scanner in the traditional sense, and basically what we do is we automate what we call the messy middle in between the discovery of a vulnerability by some tool that you're using, or some an internal team or an external team, all the way through to the actual deployment of a patch or a configuration change or whatever the control might be. So there's a lot of messy processes in the middle there. And the bigger your organization or your enterprise is, the messier it gets. And it's all of those processes that we automate. You'll hear, we talk about Nucleus as a system of record for exposures. And what that means is no matter where an exposure or vulnerability or misconfiguration was discovered, we bring it all together in one place. We normalize it all. We enrich it all with intelligence. And then we'll talk about being a system of action where we then automate all of the processes that are in workflows that are necessary to actually mitigate or remediate that vulnerability.
Yeah. I find it fascinating, Phyllis, as I turn it to you to open things up. I find it fascinating as I known Steve now for, probably close to coming up on a decade, how much, an enterprise has to deal with, like, we think about it as an MSP, typically like, oh, our scanners, right? And when you think about an MSP an enterprise having to prioritize like cloud scanners, API scanners, and you name it, numbers of, scanners, pen testing solutions, try to pull all that data together, and then correlate it, prioritize it, look at all of the systems, right, and figure out what happens first. That's pretty profound when you think about an enterprise. Like, that's a lot of work, and it's
a lot of work. It's a lot of points of data, and we were just talking in the green room before this started that vulnerability management isn't just one vulnerability scanner, right? Because there are lots of blind spots, that Chris pointed out, as well as Chip and Steve. One vulnerability scanner can't cover all your different endpoints and the different kinds of endpoints. So, someone like Steve's company understands that and gets all those different data points and aggregates them and tries to make sense of it. So,
yeah, and by the time these people figure it out, it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a constant just wave and tidal wave of stuff these days. So they're really struggling a lot to figure out how to manage this on an ongoing basis and try to a lot of them have written policies in place that kind of from a change management perspective that kind of restrict how fast they can move too. So it's a battle for especially these larger companies to kind of deal with this the way it's coming at them as fast as it is.
Good thing AI hasn't sped it up either, right?
No, it has nothing to do with it. Yeah, completely innocent.
But that's a good point, Chris. That the business sometimes slows things down on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, they want to make money. Make sure you don't prevent them from making money.
Yeah, exactly. They still, a lot of it still has to do with, they got bit in the past by some patch that went bad or whatever, and that just carried on forever. And so it is tough for companies to change that mindset, and because they haven't gone down as an operational issue, but now they have a true threat of going down because of a 0 day, just because they're happening more often.
Right. So speaking of patching or not patching, Steve, you spent over 2 decades in vulnerability management, going back to your DoD days, Department of Defense. So for MSPs who think vulnerability management is really just running a scanner once a month, we just talked about how, that's really maybe not enough. What's the one thing they're actually getting wrong?
Let's see. I would say it's probably hard to distill it down to one thing for sure. But, I watched the cyber call last week, and there was something that Phil said when I think you guys were someone asked him for advice for MSPs, and you guys were just talking about it. One of the things he said was about how vulnerability management should be thought of and really treated more more like an operational discipline versus just, something you do on a monthly basis or something you do on a quarterly basis. And I really loved that advice, because one of the biggest problems I see is so many companies do think about vulnerability and exposure management as just a periodic exercise. And that's just left over from decades of that's just how it was done and how it's kind of always been done. And it's not just smaller companies, and certainly not just MSPs, by the way. I'd say it's more prevalent there, perhaps because I think some smaller companies are resource constrained, even at Nucleus, right? We're a 120 person company, and there's only so much we can do. So I think the question really becomes then, well, what does it mean to have an operational discipline around vulnerability and exposure management? That's really the $1 million question. And I think that's probably an entire show in and of itself. We could talk about that the whole time. But I think at the highest level, it has to flip from being something that's kind of routine and periodic to something that's continuous and that runs like other operational functions, right? And then I think of within Nucleus, we've got an SRE function as an example that keeps our platform up and running all the time. And we've got we've got on-call ownership. We've got SLAs that are tied to risk tiers. And we've got these kind of steady state workflows, playbooks, runbooks. That work just never finishes, right? It's never done because, and I think that's how we have to really look at vulnerability and exposure management. And that's just kind of it starts with just a mindset shift almost for security leaders.
That's awesome. So back to the 2026 Verizon DBIR, as Andrew said in the beginning, it reported something that hasn't happened in almost 20 years, that vulnerability exploitation took over credentials as the number one breach entry point. It went from 20% to 31%. So when you saw that stat, were you like, finally people are paying attention? Or were you like, oh no, here we go? What were your thoughts?
I guess a little of both. I mean, we follow, of course, this report really closely. We read it closely every year, and along with several others that are also really good. Right? There's threat research groups that Palo Alto and Google that kind of report. They put out a similar yearly report, and I'll say the findings were, and this particular finding was not a surprise because the trends have really been tracking this way now for a few years, and you guys talked about that last week. We went from 20% to 31% from 24 to 25. But if you go back to 2022, I think it was 5%. And then 23 was 14%. So we saw kind of where things were going. We saw the trajectory. We weren't really surprised. And in fact, some of those other threat research groups published exploitation surpassing credential compromise in their reports last year. Verizon was probably kind of lagging in that sense, in that they were maybe the only one that hadn't reported on that, crossing that threshold. But yeah, all that to say, I think, vulnerability and exposure management is just it's already getting so much attention these days because of AI primarily. I feel like it was just kind of expected, and they're like, yeah, okay, moving on.
Yeah, but let's not lose sight. Credentials still a big issue, right?
Yeah.
So
100%. Yeah.
Because it's a 2, it's a big number 2.
Well, and Chris, as you pointed out before we got on, the FortiBleed, and I'll put that in there for anybody following this, you pointed out that although initially our knee jerk when we see a VPN firewall is up, there's a new vulnerability, that particular incident, or
whatever you want to call it,
whatever you want to call
campaign.
Campaign. Thank you. Campaign is much better. Is really more about. And by the way, we did see this. What's interesting, Chris, there was a very similar to the last Sonic wall where Corey Clark, came out and said, "Hey, look, there's no new vulnerability. There's no 0 day," and he was right. He stood by it very firmly.
That's right.
So it looks like. There's also these credential dumps of these devices, and now it appears, quote unquote, it's exploitation of vols, but it's not. It's still encrypted.
Yeah, I mean, it started that way, but now and then they harvested creds, and then no one changed those creds as part of that process. They And that I talked to a lot of MSPs that made that mistake, right? They immediately saw vulnerability. They didn't thoroughly read the instructions, and they updated the code on the firewall, but they didn't do the additional steps. So then the threat actors would come back and they say, well, let's go. These guys didn't do what they were supposed to, so let's just go use those credentials, and then in turn harvest even more credentials as a result of that. So yeah, and there's no, not to get on a soapbox, but there's no quality control either. I've talked to MSPs about this as well. So look, a lot of these MSPs, and they're small, so we'll give them a little bit, but they have one person that does all that, and there's no one checking that one person's work. So who's to say that they missed one, or they missed them all, or whatever the case may be? So it's a big deal.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, good point. So, I'm going to get back to, one of our favorite topics that we talked about is patching. I think I've told this story before, but I cannot stop myself from saying it. Like, I remember when I was at the agency and we went down to Paycom and talked to the J6 because there was a breach into a classified network. And, we talked about patching, how the things were, you need to patch these known vulnerabilities. It was a known vulnerability. And we're like, you need to patch. And the J6 says, patching, that's so 80s. Tell me what tool I can buy. And I was like, what? And here we are, decades later, and we're talking about patching and how important it is. And the DBIR says the mean time to patch went from 32 days to 43 days in 2026. Even as, we're talking about exploitations of vulnerabilities the exploitation of vulnerabilities is increasing. So, walk us through that gap. Why are organizations getting slower at patching at this moment in time when attackers are getting faster at exploiting vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I'll say that one was a little more interesting to me because the trend, I don't believe, was going in that direction. I mean, this was a real regression, and I don't recall that in previous DBIR reports. And so, and I like to think that the industry as a whole is getting better at this stuff and continuously improving. I don't know that anyone really knows the real answer here. I think that in general, from my perspective, organizations are getting better. I'm kind of biased. I've got limited view and the type of organizations we work with. But I think that the biggest challenge here, I think the biggest reason is that just the volume of new vulnerabilities has reached a tipping point that's beyond most organizations' capacity, right? And so operationally, if you're doing the same things or just roughly the same things that you were doing a year ago, this year you're going to be a lot slower, right? And I kind of think of it, the analogy I use is kind of like driving a car. You're just holding the gas pedal at a steady state. You'll keep going at a steady pace on a flat surface. But once you hit a big hill, your car is going to slow down and you have to press the gas more and burn more energy just to maintain that same speed. And I feel like that's kind of what's going on here with all of this volume of new vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities that are being exploited faster. It's just an uphill battle, and that a lot of organizations haven't equipped their programs to deal with quite yet.
Can I ask a quick question to Chip? Phils, Chip, is an organization like under, I know you're diligent as hell about code review, vulnerabilities. Do you think the entrance of AI in coding can be an unhidden culprit in this? And in other words, because companies are introducing that for coding, and now all of a sudden there's so much more, if you're being diligent about that code review, that you've got that could have shifted some resources or focus on your code development efforts versus your traditional patching. And
yeah, I think that's plausible, Andrew, for organizations as they're going through the early phase of AI coding assistant adoption, where they really haven't hammered down. They haven't reached this tipping point where their adoption of AI coding assistants has increased their productivity. But I actually think Steve hit it the nail on the head. And, I've seen this very directly, where I now in the SaaS world, but also just in general, where I am working inside Kaseya, that it's just volume. Like, we used to have a single dedicated DevSecOps guy that could handle everything that would come over the transom. And you'd be used to getting a critical vulnerability once, twice a week. And you could easily get your team to stay on top of that and to stay in SLA. And it wasn't a big, it was a process, as both Chris and Steve have pointed out. Like, it's never been, okay, every month, every couple of months, we're going to patch. We've always taken a different approach than that. But now what happens is, you wake up on a Monday with 15 new criticals and 30 new high vulnerabilities coming across you, some of them that are KEVs, and you've got to do something about it, like immediately. So you have to marshal resources on it that you didn't have before. And I don't think it's not easy for organizations to retool their skill set and their labor around how much more volume there actually is now. And that is AI driven. I mean, the real counterpoint here is that the AI models have made it so much easier for even people who weren't really, skilled security researchers before to turn up stuff that may have been banging around for years that nobody even bothered looking at. And they're throwing their eyes on old stuff, and that's turning into new stuff that you've got to deal with that we should have caught up with a long time ago. And that's the problem. It is just pure volume. So when I think about that 32 days to 43, that yes, absolutely. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually more than that if you really look across a wide swath of small and medium-sized businesses and software applications, software developers. It's a challenge, and it's not getting any easier yet. I think it will as people develop more agentic patching processes. But even that requires human in the loop. So, all you're doing is shifting the initial reaction time to get something into your dev pipeline, but you still have to have a human being that can actually review that. So it's a big shift that I don't think is going to go away for a number of years.
Yeah, and I think something that's adding to this is the fact that a lot of these vulnerabilities that are being discovered are not on new systems, new applications. They're old stuff, right? And so it's not like it's just something that you just worked on in the past 6 months. It could be something that was years ago, and who even knows that the developer that worked on that code is even around. So that to me is, there's two sides of it. Number one is the old stuff, and then number two is the fact that, and I see people going, what the heck is the difference from today and yesterday with AI? Well, the deal is AI is figuring out how to string these things together to get a successful exploit, versus that would take a human being countless hours trying to figure out the different combinations and sequence to do that. AI is figuring that out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so that's really is what's hurting this process.
Such a good point, Chris. If you think about this in terms of like something well known for years and years and years, like SQL injection or whatever, it was one thing, and you had to successfully exploit it, you had to put together the whole attack chain. Now the AI hands the whole attack chain to the attackers. And if you just think about every single Linux distribution, I don't know, it's probably a month ago, popped out with a vulnerability to root exploit. If you can get to the system, obviously, if it's behind a firewall and doesn't connect to the internet, it's not that big a deal. But every distribution with a complete path. Okay, here's the steps you take if you want to compromise this Linux distribution, this Linux server that you found. It just changes the game. So there's the volume thing again.
Yeah.
So this kind of dovetails into my next question, but I'm going to send it over to Steve first, but also I'm curious on your two thoughts, because you work a lot with MSPs. I mean, how do I patch? What's the prioritization? So, in April, NIST announced some changes in NVD. It's going to be risk-based triage. So most CVEs won't get a severity score or enrichment data unless they, meet other specific criteria, like being on CISAKEV's list. So for MSP relying on that data to prioritize their patching, what should they do? Now you're telling me there's tons of volume. I don't have updated processes. I probably don't even have the staff I need. I'm getting maybe process that I was relying on prior with CVSS score isn't there. I've got vulnerabilities from decades past. I've got CAV, how is it that an organization can prioritize?
Steve, you please talk about what, because this is something near and dear to your heart. You're dealing with that you had to figure out.
Yeah, for sure. And Last year there was the fire drill where everyone thought NVD could shut down because of a funding issue. And so what happened at that time was at Nucleus and across every vendor, I would say that every serious vendor that consumes NVD information is they started to figure out ways to operate without that enrichment. And so we certainly figured that out at Nucleus where we don't depend on it. So I guess the question becomes, for most organizations, are they actually relying, to what degree are they actually relying on NVD in the first place? If they're just using tools like, Defender, Sentinel-1 or whatever it might be, or Tenable or Qualys or whatever, I think that those vendors have largely been able to compensate for the enrichment that's not happening. I mean, it's been a steady decline over the last 12, 18 months, or probably longer than that. And so my general thought is it's probably not as big of a problem as it might appear on the surface if you're primarily just relying on security vendors that to detect vulnerabilities and issues in your environment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think though, still for like the MSP, it could still be challenging, to try to prioritize because they're trying to manage the different organizations. And it's like, I don't know how many people MSPs have dedicated towards this.
Well, Kim brought up a great point in chat, right? It sounds like costs are going up. And Gary Pica, when he was on here, we used to always say that sounds expensive, and costs are definitely going up, Kim. And, this is a piece where, in terms of what your offering is today, right? This is big piece of advisory services and education to your customer. And, we got to give them, red pill, blue pill, right? Explain how this could impact, critical systems that impact revenue that Blakely talks about all the time. And we can't obviously go through a complete sales, VCIO sales training here. But bottom line is you got to be focusing on their critical systems that drive revenue if you're going to get any type of wallet share out of that. But Chris, are you, as someone that works now with end customers mostly, how are you guys looking at this, in terms of the exponential, I shouldn't say exponential, but the increase in cost in this is not.
Yeah, it's kind of like the best analogy is just the crime rates going up in your neighborhood. I mean, that's just the bottom line, and you're going to have to make changes, right? You might have to add some additional security features to your cars. You might have to add some locks to the windows. You might have to install a new security system in your home, whatever the case may be. I mean, that's just kind of the bottom line of this deal. And it would be, I think in this situation, in the past, I think that's been a harder story for MSPs to explain or people to explain to clients. But there's no doubt. I mean, the evidence there, everybody kind of understands this AI and how powerful it is. So for you to just change that conversation and say, yeah, it's very powerful, but the best way to say it is we both have the good guys and the bad guys have the same tools. So, we gotta do our best to kind of keep up with this stuff. And it's an overnight change. It's going to feel like that because in reality, a lot of us have been preparing for this, but to the general person, this is an overnight change. And they're just going to have to kind of step up and deal with it to mitigate the risk. And there's no way you can give that away for free if you're an MSP.
For sure. All right, let's move over to Chip.
Yeah, I mean, we keep talking about volume and increase of risk here. 263% increase in CV submissions through 2025 from 2020. NIST projecting, Steve, over 60,000 vulnerabilities reported so far in 2026. I mean, I know it really seemed to ramp up. My personal opinion in March, like things all of a sudden went hyperbolic, where it was a steady uptick, and then we all of a sudden went through the roof. The question is, did NIST, were they just not aware of how fast this might change? I mean, I think I was caught unaware of how fast this was going to change because it was steadily increasing, but bam, should we have expected something different from NIST to have built a system that was capable of handling this over the past 20 years?
I mean, it would have been nice, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that, and it's more than NIST, really, too. I mean, I think whenever I think about the NVD, I also think about the CVE program that MITRE runs as well, and they kind of go hand in hand in that whole disclosure pipeline. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that none of these programs have really evolved to meet the needs of the industry, and that's unfortunate. That said, these are some pretty hard problems. And, when it comes to funding issues and how government programs work and how just government agencies and organizations work, I can't say that, I would have bet on them solving this problem and doing a much better job. So yeah, I don't think I would call it, I don't know. Some people call it a failure. You can call it a failure, but I mean, I think it's clear in my mind what's most important. What the most important service that they provide today, in my mind, is just a common identifier, right? Which is kind of where the whole program started. It's like if we don't have a single identifier that we can all use to kind of speak the same language when we're referring to a specific vulnerability, then it's chaos. And at this point, I'll just be happy if that remains in place. And I think it will remain in place because that's relatively cheap and easy to maintain. All the enrichment and everything else, those are much harder problems. But if they just keep the CVE as the common identifier for us all, I think it's a win for everybody. Maybe I'm a little pessimistic, but I think that's all we need.
I agree.
At least then there's a common ontology and taxonomy for us to talk about it and refer to it. Go ahead, Phyllis.
I was going to say, I worked with those guys over at NIST for several years. And just like MSPs and everybody's resource constrained, there's one person who works on NVD and CVEs over at NIST. And so, they took a hit with funding, and that's why CVEs went away and all that kind of stuff. So, it's not that NIST isn't trying to keep up. The bench is thin. They don't have big programs. They just have staff. You know what I mean? For the cyber part, it's not like I'm going to put a satellite up in the sky and maybe you can rejigger some funds, like maybe a former agency that I worked for, whatever. You know what I mean? So, this is when the funding gets cut. It's people for them. It really is. So, in this defense, there's one person doing all of that work.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, Phyllis, because NIST, like to the layperson, sounds like this giant government organization, but when you actually walk through the doors, it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so they're a victim of the same massive increase in volume that all the rest of us are, and so that begs the next question, Steve. So for an MSP, small, medium, even a large MSP, if you don't have a large enough dedicated security analyst team already, and the small guys, maybe no one, right? It's just somebody else's third job or third hat they're wearing at that MSP. What would you advise in terms of putting together a risk-based management package around vulnerabilities? What can they do if they're starting from scratch to operationalize this?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's a big question, starting from scratch. I mean, just back to the NVD for a second. I don't think, like I said, I don't think it really changes, what's going on with the NVD doesn't change too much in terms of how they should approach vulnerability and exposure management, right? Because, when you think about what they do, as far as the enrichment goes, like NVD provides some VSS scores and CVE strings. And, that information in most cases is provided by the what's called the CNA or the vendor when the CVE ID is issued. And so NIST would have a role where, if by some chance that information wasn't in there, they would compensate for that and add it. But for the most part, all the same data is still in there. So I think it's the impact is not as bad as maybe it might be perceived to be. But starting from scratch, like I said, when all of this started, I think a lot of the security vendors that are in this space quickly adapted and figured out figured out how they can live in a world where NVD is only providing that identifier and nothing else. All they're doing is issuing identifiers. And so what that amounts to is basically going out and partnering with threat intel vendors and building their own threat and vulnerability intelligence, which is what most of us have done. And so I think the most important thing at this point would be to partner with the right vendors, with the right service companies that have a pulse on this and that have had a plan and have executed a plan to address these gaps with NVD and with NIST and with the CVE program. And I think, as a small business, I don't think you can afford to just dedicate people to full-time, focus on solving these types of problems. It's like, hey, I want partners that I can trust are on top of this and can adapt when things like, NVD enrichment stop happening. I think that's the big thing.
So taking it maybe, to a logical extension, I think what I hear you saying is that it's gotten so busy that running a vulnerability management program in a small firm just isn't going to work on its own. And you've got to develop relationships with vendors to help you triage and actually tell you what's important. And maybe it's an exercise in humility. Like, we can't know everything anymore. We've got to find vendors who specialize and they can help us triage and prioritize what's got to get done. I mean, is that how you see it? You put together a package of experts to help you navigate it.
I think so. I think the partnerships are key here. I mean, I'm not saying that internally there isn't a role that your people and your security team has. But I think who you partner with, both from a technology and a services standpoint, is critical. And so, yeah, picking the vendors and the companies that are really keeping a pulse on what's happening in this ecosystem, because it's changing so quickly, right? Like that's I think the most important thing. And maybe that sounds self-serving. I'm sorry if it does, but that's
no. I mean, I'm agreeing with you, and I'm actually going to throw up a softball, but I just want to get your reaction to it. I mean, it feels like we're witnessing an inflection point. We're in the middle of an inflection point where the reliance across the industry of a government-backed entity to do all this is going to give way to some kind of consortium that comes together of private businesses, private security experts and companies that are going to have to self-assemble into something else, or maybe groups of them that self-assemble into something else that people can rely on. Is that, you see it the same way?
I think so. For certain things, I think it's going to be really difficult to replace, what NIST has been doing. Like I said, it's going to be really hard to be that central authority for issuing those vulnerability identifiers. For most other things, yeah, I think so. And even around the practice of vulnerability and exposure management itself. I'm part of a group, for example, this is a shameless plug, but I'm part of a group called OEMF, which is the Open Exposure Management Framework. And it's under OASIS, right? The nonprofit group OASIS. And our mission is just to build an exposure management framework that organizations can use to do just what you're asking me a few minutes ago, which is, if you're starting from scratch, what do you do? Where do you go? Well, you need a framework. And before this, there was something called CTEM, which is a Gartner coined term, stands for continuous threat and exposure management. But that's a Gartner thing, and it's not something that's evolving and adapting over the years either. It was kind of a thing that they put out in 2023 or 2024. It was a good alternative to the old way of doing vulnerability management from a kind of process perspective and the framework standpoint, but it didn't evolve. So all that to say, yeah, your question reminded me of that. And it's like, this OASIS group was a bunch of us just realizing like, yeah, we need to kind of take this into our own hands and put something out in the world that everyone else can use, and no one else is going to do it really. So that's what we did.
Yeah. Chris, sounds like we need to set up a crowdfunding campaign for the guys at NIST who are trying to manage all this.
That's the only way. I think. That's the only way. I think. Yeah, I think you're right. Let's launch it right after the show. It's the way to go. Am I next? Chip, are you done?
You are.
All right.
You.
Hey,
that was your segue.
That was my segue. Gotcha. Yeah. Hey, so plenty of MSP owners, Steve, are reading about this Mythos level AI discovering vulnerabilities, and they might be thinking, hey, this is an enterprise problem, or their clients might be thinking it's an enterprise problem, not mine. Given the shifts that we've been talking about with DBIR, with NVD, is this belief that this is an enterprise, not mine, is that belief just flat out dead now, or is there some truth still left in that for the small clients?
I would like to call it dead. I think that there are probably some impacts of Mythos type models that maybe don't affect MSPs quite as much, or maybe at all, right? And I think about enterprises developing custom software, whether it's for internal use or to sell to other companies. How Mythos affects those businesses is going to be a lot different than it affects an MSP. And we're one of those businesses, by the way, and we've seen and felt a lot of that pain where our engineering teams are developing code twice as fast. So therefore vulnerabilities twice as fast. Our security teams now are armed with AI tools in addition to the old, we're still running, Sneak and all the other code scanning stuff, but now they've got AI tools as well. So we're finding a lot more vulnerabilities. An MSP that's not building software isn't going to feel a lot of that pain, for example. But even so, I think that MSP should take this very seriously, just because of all the things that we were just talking about, right? The sheer volume of new vulnerabilities is rising quickly. The amount of time that you have to mitigate them before they're exploited is shrinking quickly. And so MSPs use a lot of third-party software, and so they're going to feel all of this pain too.
Yeah, and I think too that a lot of MSPs might not be developing an application, but they're developing a bunch of automation and a lot of what we would in the past call middleware code, and so they might not be realizing it, but more MSPs today, in my opinion, are developing stuff than they did just a couple of years ago, just from all the stuff they're doing automation. I'm seeing that from the smallest MSPs all the way up. So.
Yeah, and I don't know the MSP space nearly as good as you guys do, but from what I've seen now with the ability to generate software without having any coding skills, I would predict that we're not too far off from a future where MSPs are rolling custom software out on a daily basis. Maybe they're already doing. Maybe you guys are seeing some of that. But
there's some of them out there doing it.
Pretty quickly, they could be in the same problem, and start and feel some of those same pains I was just talking about from generating so much code and so much vulnerabilities themselves, just because it's so easy to do now.
No, exactly.
Chris, can I throw one in quick?
Sure.
I want to be sensitive to time. One thing that's been just ruminating in my head, I'm going to write my weekly newsletter on, is what's going to happen when a vibe-coded dashboard that's connected to a bunch of data sources in an MSP's client, right? They get popped, call you up, pretend you're still an MSP, Chris, hey, we just got popped, and you go out and figure out that, it's because of a vibe coded app that didn't have any, scanning, blah, 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 blah. I'm wondering, what's going to happen from a cyber insurance claim. And I did some research on this, and I don't want to digress too much, but I'm just wondering if you've seen this, is that like some of the big players are putting exclusion clauses in there. Now, not all of them,
right?
But there are certainly some of the big players out there, Steve, that are going, not our problem. We don't have enough actuarial data, because that's what typically drives, right, how they're going to price something like this. But it's that whole thing. It just, I was like, I wonder how this is going to play out.
Well, and MSPs really don't define themselves to the insurance companies as a software development company either, right? So if something happens as a result of some software development that they never necessarily didn't disclose, that could create its own issues.
Well, your indemnification goes out the window, and you're good luck to you. So anyway, back on track, but it's going to be interesting times here with this stuff as well.
Yeah. So Steve, you've built Nucleus around the idea of unifying and automating vulnerability workflows without giving away any of the secret sauce. What's the one capability you're building right now specifically because of what's happening with the NVD and AI-driven vulnerability discovery?
I mean, honestly, geez, we don't have much time here. I don't know that there is one capability I can point to. And Andrew kind of said it best at the beginning when we started 6.5 years ago. We kind of had a vision. We knew there were certain things we needed to do, and we've been focusing on those things the entire time. Right? It's like, hey, we know that we need an integration platform to bring all this data in to enrich it with intelligence, things like that. We know we need an automation platform to orchestrate and automate all those manual processes I talked about. We know we need to have the world's best vulnerability intelligence in order to make all of this work. And so those are still the things that are the focus today. A lot of folks want to know, even in sales calls and stuff, like, hey, what are you guys doing now that, we're in this mythos moment and everything else? And our roadmap, I mean, it's certainly evolved, but our core focus areas are really the same and probably more relevant and important now than ever. We have a whole lot of really cool and interesting capabilities coming out that are kind of being peppered into our platform and our app. But I wouldn't even say there's any one major thing that I could point to that's I would say is directly related. We're just kind of double downing on that original thesis of like, hey, we need to have these foundational things in place in order to really solve this problem.
But there are companies coming to you though, Steve, aren't they now? Like, because of this, saying, do you have an enriched, intel, and can you help us with this problem? And you, I'm pretty sure, have put a lot of resources into this.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. We were just talking about messaging the other day, and Andrew, I know you're really good at this stuff. But one of the taglines that our team likes internally is mythos, we were built for this, right? Because everything I just said, right? These were all the things that we've been working on for years. And it just so happens that right now, it's more important. It's more important than ever. So yes, it's been really good for business. But to some extent, it's it really, these are really the same problems that existed 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. They're just a little more pressure and things are moving a little faster.
Can I ask one more question, Chris, real quick?
Sure.
Steve,
Yeah.
Do you envision, Steve, at some point you might become, a recorded future, Intel 411, or somebody that allows consumption of your enriched data sets?
Yeah, absolutely. That is on our roadmap. And that's one that we've been working on for some time. We've had a plan for that for a while, but absolutely. I mean, vulnerability intelligence now, especially with the gaps in the government programs, the CD program and this program, again, more important than it's ever been. And so we knew we had to build it for our own use. And so, yes, why not? Why not expose that to the rest of the world and sell your sawdust, so to speak, I guess.
Cool.
Hey, make some money off of it. Hey, so we'll close with the if every MSP and SMB owner on this call is on this call and then closes his or her laptop, and then tomorrow morning that has one thing to deal with regarding this vulnerability landscape, the dying NVD and AI discovery, vulnerability discovery, and all that kind of stuff, what should that one thing be they do?
Man, you guys like these one thing questions. I'll have to.
We don't want to put you in a box, Steve.
Yeah, God forbid, Steve, we put
One thing,
on the line here or anything like that.
one thing, not two things, not 1.5 things, one thing.
Honestly, if you're going to pin me down to one thing, I would say take a step back and conduct an honest assessment of your program as it stands today and its maturity, right? Look at the vendors that you're using, look at the tools you're using, look at the gaps in coverage that you have where you're missing certain assets or you're missing certain categories of exposures. Take a look at your remediation processes and your performance on that end. You're going to find shortfalls in most of those things, as every company does, and then just develop a plan to improve those things over time to get to a world where you can focus on fixing what matters most as quickly as possible.
That's actually excellent advice.
Yeah, you did good that one. Good job. We might bring you back.
Fingers crossed.
Oh, Steve, I know we're at the top of the hour, 1 minute over. Really appreciate you coming out. And like I said, it couldn't be a better segue of time to off on the heels of Phil's comment that this is where to spend. If there's only one, there we go again. Top place you can spend it. It's vulnerability management. So appreciate you lending your expertise to us and hope to have you back soon. Chip, I know you're off the heels of a trip abroad, so thank you. Probably dealing with some jet lag, and appreciate you, as always, coming on. Chris, thanks a million. Phyllis, everybody have a fantastic day. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.
If you're in the Write a Boom community but not in our Discord yet, you're missing where the real conversation happens. Join community.writeaboom.com to access cybercall discussions, upcoming CTFs, boom camps, and early access to what's coming next. If you want to stay close to what's actually happening in the MSP security space, I'll see you there.